Hey everybody, it's Chad. This is my first video for Mississippi Cannabis News Network, and I'm very excited. They asked if I would do some legal videos, and I said yes. As you know, I'm a lawyer by profession, and so I've done some exhaustive videos on medical marijuana and Initiative 65 and the legislative process, so I thought this might be fun to talk about something not related to that and have a little moment of, hopefully, some fun that gets you to thinking and asking some questions or looking some stuff up for yourself. So growing up, I know we've always heard people say, well, it's a free country, or people say, I have First Amendment right, I can say what I want. And so I wanted to talk to you about the First Amendment and what that means. Now, this is not an exhaustive video on the First Amendment. Obviously, the First Amendment is not well settled. It's not clear cut and black and white, because we still have tons of lawsuits about it and tons of interpretation about it. So I just wanted to start off by reading you the First Amendment, and then we'll talk a little bit about it. So, all right. So as you know, the First Amendment, Bill of Rights, first one, adopted into our Constitution almost 20 years after our Constitution and after we became a country. So First Amendment says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Okay, so we'll start at the very beginning with the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. So obviously, Congress can make no law respecting an establishment of religion. So you hear people say, well, we're a Christian nation. We're actually not. We never have been. We never should be or will be. And that was the whole point of that, to put that in our Bill of Rights and in the very first sentence of the First Amendment. So when you think about it in historical context, it makes sense, right? So coming from England, they had centuries of this upheaval and war and death, deciding whether or not they were Catholic or under the Church of England. You know, with Henry VIII, he made himself the head of the Church of England so he could divorce Catherine of Aragon to marry Anne Boleyn. And then obviously when his daughter Mary ascended to the throne, she went back to Catholicism. And then when Elizabeth came after her, we went back to the Church of England. So it sort of makes sense seeing that historical context. And when people got here, I'm sure the first thing they were thinking was, we don't have a religion. So obviously that's still in place. So one of the interesting things about Congress cannot establish a religion is that you think about some of the historical cases in our country, like one dealing with the Ten Commandments at courthouses. So, you know, there was this big controversy about them having to remove the 10 Commandments. Well, you know, if you look at some of the cases, especially one in particular that I'm thinking of, was that another group, whether they were atheists or non-Christian, whatever, they wanted to erect their own monument at the courthouse. And so, obviously, we can't have one and not the other, because the government can't establish or seem like they're promoting a religion over the other. And so that's why they were all removed. And so, and that starts to make sense. The other thing is, in this country, you have the right to believe whatever you want. However, you do not have the right to practice whatever you want. And so that's where the limitations start. And again, a couple of cases, one were an Indian tribe that were smoking peyote as part of their religious ceremonies. Well, that was illegal. So obviously they were allowed to believe whatever, but they could not practice that. So another thing you get into is, you know, some groups that maybe part of their religion are human sacrifices. So maybe we're going back to Aztec or biblical times, maybe with some sacrificial humans or sacrificial whatever. Again, you have the right to believe it. You do not have the right to practice it. So that was sort of some of the limitations placed on that. And that really sort of starts to make sense. So another thing that anybody always says when I have discussions like this, and I make it sound like, you know, we're just Me and all my friends are always sitting around talking about the First Amendment. We're not. But, one of the sort of the counter arguments that you always hear is, well, what about our Pledge of Allegiance? What about one nation under God? Or what about our money? In God we trust. Well, historically, that was not even a part of our Pledge of Allegiance, or it certainly wasn't on our currency up until the 50s, I think 1953. And if you look at that time frame of when that happened, obviously there was this huge sort of countrywide issue with maybe communists or looking for communism, lots of congressional hearings and things like that. And that's when that actually got added. And so that has historically not been a part of our things. And there have been some challenges to it. I know that there was a couple of lawsuits. One, I think, out of California. I think the Supreme Court ended up saying that the dad doesn't have standing, so they didn't even address whether or not that being in our Pledge of Allegiance violated the Free Exercise Clause or the Establishment Clause. I know there's been a couple of other ones that have sort of crept up, I think, in the early 2000s, but I don't think it's been addressed at all. The other thing that you hear about is, well, what about prayer in school? So I know that this has been a big one. So can you pray in school? Of course you can pray in school. So I always tell people, if you think there's not prayer in school, you've obviously never had really hard teachers, because I know for me, I was praying a lot before exams. So the thing is yes, you are allowed to pray in school. Students are allowed to gather privately and pray. Are you allowed to pray yourself in school? What can't happen is that the school forces everyone to a certain prayer, or forces all the students to engage in something. Which absolutely makes sense. And I always, tell like big supporters of prayer in school that seem to get real aggravated and upset at, depending on what they are, Christian or whatever. I'd say, now imagine the opposite. Imagine someone that is not Christian. Imagine atheist or whatever, satanic worshiper, requiring all of your kids and the students to do a satanic prayer or whatever. You would equally be outraged. And of course, that just makes sense. So yes, you can pray in school. That's really not an issue. You just can't force everybody to do the same prayer. So, all right, on to freedom of speech, because this is what I want to talk to you about. So the freedom of speech, it protects you from government interference. And so it tells you what you can say, but more importantly, what can't be said. And there's some things that are not covered by the First Amendment. Obscenity, I've got them written down so I don't forget. Obscenity, true threats, incitement to lawless action, or what we call fighting words, and obviously defamation. That's why we still have slander, libel, defamation suits, and things like that. So freedom from government interference. So what does that mean? Well, to give you a lawyer answer, it depends. And the reason it depends is because there's all kinds of things that a court would look at. Time, manner, and place restrictions, or the context of what's being said. One of the earliest forms of what you can't say that you hear if you ever take any constitutional law classes or a First Amendment class is you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. Well, that obviously makes sense. Some political speech is protected. It seems to carry like a heavier protection. And so obviously that's so we're not suppressing someone's political beliefs or things like that. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't go unchecked. There are still limitations to that. And so that's what you find with a lot of this is that, yeah, you may have the freedom to do this, but it's not an absolute right, and it doesn't have its own sort of parameters for it. So we talked about freedom of speech being free from government interference. So let's just talk about social media. So Twitter, Facebook, they are not the government. So your post on there, your tweets and all this, they are not protected by the First Amendment. So let me tell you why. It's because when you sign up for a private entity like Facebook or Twitter or Instagram, you also accept their terms of use. So if you violate those terms of use, then absolutely they can take action or do whatever they need to do. And of course that makes sense, right? So they are still private companies, and so they're not held to that. Here's the other thing. Those are voluntary. So nobody forces you to have a Facebook. Nobody forces you to have a Twitter. So these are things that if you want to do, you can, but you still have to abide by the terms of use, because that's what you agreed to when you signed up for it. So I hope that this helps sort of get a conversation started, or you just find it interesting and maybe want to know a little more about it. I'm going to keep going with these videos. I'll just go down the list and we'll talk about some of them. Like I said, it can't be exhaustive or I would be here all night, because there's been so many cases and so many opinions about the First Amendment and about each different category. Even though the First Amendment is small, it packs a huge punch, because we're talking about religion, we're talking about speech, we're talking about being able to peaceably assemble, and we're talking about being able to file grievances against the government, and we're also talking about the freedom of the press. And the freedom of the press itself is a huge issue, because then we can get into cases like the New York Times and the Watergate scandal and all of those things to see what limitations that placed on it. Anyway, I hope this helps. I hope you're excited about these. I'm excited about them. It might be because I'm just a lawyer nerd. But again, you know, this is what's so great about this, what they call a living, our Constitution is a living document, because it is still open for interpretation, which is great job security for me. So anyways, I hope you'll join me. If you have any questions, I'm always happy to answer them, and I will see you very soon. Okay, bye.